So hello everyone and welcome to another interesting video. Imagine spending 10 years and billions of dollars developing a promising drug, only for the drug to fail in the clinical trial. And this happens to 90% of the drug. So what actually goes wrong? In this video, we'll break down the real reasons why most of the clinical trial fail and what every clinical research professional should understand. Before we begin, we are close to 10,000 subscribers. If you enjoy learning about clinical research, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that it will help us grow, and consider becoming a channel member so that we can improve clinical research community. Without further ado, let's start. So first and foremost, let us understand the reality of drug development. So as we've discussed, it takes around 10 to 15 years of development time for the drug to come into clinical trial. Okay, so before the phase 1 clinical trial start, there are preclinical trials and there is a major chunk of drug development. So it takes around 10 to 15 years, including the phase trial, for the drug to come to the market. This particular drug, on an average, requires $1 to $2 billion of investment, and this is the research and development not only for the molecule to be conceptualized, but to be analyzed, to be synthesized, to be tested in laboratories on microorganisms, on animal models, and then coming on to the human clinical trial. Now, the overall survival rate of that drug, okay, it is almost 10%. Okay, 10% out of hundreds and millions of drug. Okay, so the investment is quite higher, the efforts are quite higher. Okay, and most of the drug fail during the human clinical trial. Okay, because whatever drug you produce in the lab, it is not necessary that it will show the same effect on the human body. Okay, it depends upon a lot of factors, how the body reacts to the drug, how the drug affects the body. Okay, so that is the reality of drug development. Okay, that is the basis that we will start understanding. Now once the drug is developed, it moves on from animal testing to human testing. Okay, and human testing is done during the phase trial. So whenever a clinical trial starts, it starts with phase 1, where the safety of the drug is checked on the healthy volunteers. Okay, now we are not targeting the disease patient, but we are focusing only on the safety of the drug, whether it is safe in small quantities. Then comes to phase 2, where the dosage of the drug is decided. Various doses are given to various volunteers and the efficacy is analyzed. Once that efficacy and dosage is established, then we move on to the larger scale confirmation of that particular drug efficacy in phase 3 trial. Okay, and once the drug shows proper efficacy in phase 3 trial, we move on to regulatory review, and once the regulatory approves, then the drug is marketed. But you need to understand that the highest failure rate occurs in phase 2 clinical trial. Okay, so in this particular section where the efficacy and dosage of the drug is being tested, 90% of the clinical trial fail there itself. They never see the day of the light of phase 3 trial. Okay, so you need to understand that out of various phases of the clinical trial, the maximum damage happens during phase 2. So now let us understand what exactly happens in phase 2 and why is phase 2 the graveyard of a lot of drug or a lot of clinical trial. Okay, so you need to understand that whenever a drug which work in animal model need not work in humans. Okay, because human body reacts differently to different drug, different temperatures, different genetic makeup. Okay, that can directly have an impact on the drug's ability to show efficacy. The next possible reason of failure could be incorrect dosing strategy. Whatever the scientists have developed during the laboratory study need not translate into the human dosing, followed by weak efficacy signal. Whatever signal they showed promising efficacy in the laboratory, they might show weak signals in humans. And if the drug is not as effective, then there is no point of this particular drug to get regulatory approval and to come into the market. Followed by poor endpoint selection. Now, for example, if it is a cancer trial, okay, now here the focus is not to cure. Okay, a lot of drug do not have that potential to cure the cancer entirely. There the endpoints are improving quality of life, overall survival. But if you choose that particular drug to cure the cancer, which is not possible, then that clinical trial is not successful because your endpoint selection has been wrong. your selection, if the molecule is not efficacious, you should test whether it can improve the overall survival, improve the quality of life. Again, that is one of the major reasons. I have given an example of oncology trial, but if you consider any kind of trial, there are various endpoints. Okay, if that endpoints are incorrectly selected, the trial fails. And last but not the least, the human biology, as we have discussed, is complex and unpredictable. Okay, now why a thing happens, it happens during the human clinical trial, it is not essentially established. Okay, there could be various reasons such as environmental, genetic. Okay, uh, it- depending upon what kind of subject they have selected, whether the subject have taken any concomitant medication, whether there were drug interaction. Okay, there could be thousands of reasons, but to test all of them requires a lot of R&D. A lot of R&D translates into a lot of funding requirement. Okay, and that could kill a pharmaceutical company's funding channels. Okay, even considering that, also a lot of pharmaceutical company pull the plug on the further testing of the molecule because they do not see this particular molecule being efficacious and being efficacious enough to market that particular drug. Okay, so these were the major reason why most of the clinical trial fail during phase 2. Now, apart from phase 2 clinical trial, there are other aspects such as safety concern. Okay, and safety concern is one of the most important aspect whenever it comes to clinical trial. Okay, now when I say safety concern, there could be the molecule showing higher amount of severe adverse event. The molecule could show long-term toxicity, which could directly hamper. Okay, if I want to get a drug to be cured, and if it is having long-term toxicity, then it defeats the purpose of the drug being given. Okay, again, if there is risk to organ damage followed by unacceptable risk benefit ratio, if I'm having a lot of risk to my health instead of benefit from that particular drug, then it makes no sense for the drug to come into the market. Okay, and last but not the least, safety signal. Okay, one safety signal which can directly impact the subject safety or the safety of the study volunteer can kill that particular drug. Okay, if the regulators find that this particular drug has a major risk to subject safety, they will not consider what kind of efficacy signal are there, because safety is the utmost priority. Okay, so that also can have a major impact on 90% of the clinical trial failing. The next aspect is the financial and regulatory risk. Now, phase 1 to phase 3 clinical trial requires massive amount of R&D budget. Okay, and this directly has an impact on the financial status of that particular research agency or the pharmaceutical company. Okay, no company has unlimited supply of money. Okay, you need to optimize your resources so that you can get value out of it. At the end of the day, even in drug development, it is a business. Okay, that business needs to balance between research, between the good for the people, and between the drug development cost. Okay, if everything works out, then it makes sense for the pharmaceutical company to come ahead with the clinical trial. So each phase of the clinical trial requires a lot of money. Now, if that particular money is not utilized properly, okay, if there are failures at late stage of the clinical trial, for example, a molecule is developed during all phases of the clinical trial, preclinical phase, animal models, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and in phase 3 if that particular drug does not show efficacy, it fails, it can directly hamper the investor faith in your particular company. Okay, late stage failure of the clinical trial can directly hamper the drug development because the investor would not give you additional money to continue. Okay, that is one of the major reasons. And last but not the least, the regulatory challenges. Definitely, if your drug is showing efficacy data which is poor, okay, if there is poor trial design, if there is variable involved in approval standard, then that also has direct impact on the drug development. Okay, so financial and regulatory risk are one of the most uh, highly impacted reason that can kill your clinical trial or the drug from coming into the market. The other reason for 90% of the clinical trial failing is patient recruitment and strategic error. Now, whenever it comes to recruiting subject for the clinical trial, you need to understand it is one of the most difficult aspect, because convincing anyone to ask them to participate in a clinical trial, because people generally even after explaining them, do not have a positive impact whenever it comes to participating clinical trial. And I'm not blaming anyone. Even if I ask you that this is for the good of the society, can you participate in a clinical trial as a healthy volunteer? I can assure that 9 out of 10 people will not. And this is human psychology. Although the clinical trial have various safety protocols, you will get compensated in case that molecule fail. They will take care of you for all hospital expenses and everything, but still there is a risk. Okay, and that risk no one is willing to take. Therefore recruitment becomes the major bottleneck whenever it comes to clinical trial, and 80% of the clinical trial gets killed because there is delay in recruitment. Okay, and this particular delay in recruitment followed by the high dropout rate from the clinical trial does not gather enough safety data or efficacy data to submit to regulatory authority. If you do not have ample amount of data, then there is no point of that particular data being submitted to regulatory, and that drug will never see the day of the light in the market. Okay, so recruitment bottleneck is one of the major challenge whenever it comes to conduct a successful clinical trial. Now, the next aspect is the criteria. Now, whenever it comes to clinical trial, there are certain inclusion and exclusion criteria, but a lot of people are not very well aware. And this particular lack of awareness amongst the study volunteer creates panic or creates disbelief. This directly has impact on their participation in clinical trial. And again, as I've said, no participant, less data, then that directly translate into regulatory failure. Now there are even strategic errors. Okay, if the scientist or the pharmaceutical company, the drug development team selects wrong biological target or weak biomarker strategy, then that will directly have your impact on efficacy data. Okay, if the biological target is incorrect, then the efficacy will not be shown. The biomarker are incorrect selected, then that will not show any kind of efficacy. Okay, so patient recruitment and strategic challenges need to be overcome so that the trial can be successful. Okay, next point would be the endpoints. Now, as I've discussed, the endpoint needs to be realistic. Unrealistic endpoint and incorrect patient population has direct impact on the trial success. So I hope you would have understood that whenever it comes to clinical trial, it is very important that everything goes wrong, everything is planned as per the drug development strategy. And now I hope you appreciate that whatever drugs are in the market, they have taken a lot of efforts for the drug to reach to you. Okay, and you should also appreciate that if 90% of the drug are failing, which means there are certain checks and balances which are protecting you from bad drugs. Okay, so thank you for watching this video till the end. Please make sure that you subscribe to the channel and keep on supporting us, because we are very close to 10,000 subscriber and we need your support for continuing with such quality content. Thank you.